Picture this: a British troopship, over 600 souls aboard, sailing smoothly toward the South African coast. But in the dead of night, disaster strikes. What unfolds next is one of the most legendary acts of courage in maritime history. Sharks circle, chaos erupts. And yet these soldiers stand firm, putting women and children first, in a heroic decision that would echo through all time. This is more than just a shipwreck. It is a story of unimaginable courage and sacrifice. Dive into the harrowing final moments of the Birkenhead. Will you stand with them? It was the early hours of February 26, 1852, and the sea off the coast of South Africa was eerily calm. The British troopship HMS Birkenhead sailed swiftly toward Algoa Bay, carrying 630 or so souls, most of them soldiers and officers, and a handful of women and children. The contingent was made up of troops from various regiments, sent to reinforce British forces in the Cape Colony as they continued their fight in the 8th Cape Frontier War. Captain Robert Salmond stood on the bridge, watching the dark horizon. The ship was sailing close to the shore, a decision made in haste to save time. It was a routine enough night. The warm air of the South African coast provided no indication of the impending catastrophe. Below deck, the soldiers slept soundly in their hammocks, unaware that their fates would change forever in just minutes. Suddenly, at around 2 in the morning, a tremendous jolt rocked the Birkenhead. The ship had struck an uncharted rock near Danger Point with such force that it split open the hull beneath the waterline. The iron tore against stone, reverberating through the ship and waking many from their slumber with a chill of fear. Water immediately rushed into the lower decks, flooding the compartments where hundreds of men were quartered. Panic spread quickly, and in the darkness soldiers scrambled to escape the rising threat, while dozens of men drowned where they slept. There were those who shouted for help, others clawed their way up the ladders. The seawater surged higher, sweeping over the troops still trapped below, dragging many under before they had a chance to escape. Sergeant Macpherson, a veteran of numerous campaigns, pushed through the confusion. "Up! Get up, lads! Get up topside!" he bellowed, pulling men to their feet. But the water was rising fast, and it was already too late for many. The narrow corridors were clogged with the desperate trying to reach the upper deck, but the sea was remorseless. Above, Captain Salmond quickly assessed the situation. The ship was mortally wounded and sinking fast, and the lifeboats were their only chance of survival. He turned to the first officer and ordered him to prepare the crafts, but they both knew there were not enough. With only 3 lifeboats available, there was no way to save everyone. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Seaton, commanding officer of the 74th Regiment, emerged from the confusion with grim determination. "Stand fast!" he shouted. His charges, though frightened, obeyed the command. The troops fell into disciplined ranks on the deck, standing at attention as the water crept up around their boots. They knew the women and children would be first in the boats. There would be no rush for safety, no panic. Their orders were clear. It would become a legendary study in discipline through the ages. The females and children were gathered and brought to the boats. As the cutters were lowered into the ocean, the men watched in silence. Lieutenant Seaton had made it clear that the safety of the ladies and children came before their own lives. The small vessels rocked gently as they vanished into the night, carrying the only likely survivors. With the boats gone, the soldiers simply waited at attention, their faces set in resolve, their backs straight. It was then the Birkenhead lost her fight. The ship broke in 2, and the stern section began to sink. Troops were thrown into the sea, where they clung to wreckage or swam towards the distant beckoning shore. The sea claimed many lives that night, but it was not just the water that posed a threat. Great white sharks, drawn by the commotion, began to circle the wreck. One by one, castaways vanished beneath the waves, their screams swallowed by the sound of the sea. Cornet Ralph Bond, one of the survivors, later recalled the horror of that moment. "The sharks took many that night," he said, his voice thick with memory. "I saw men disappear, pulled under by something I could not see." In the ocean, the night dragged on with agonizing slowness. For those who had not drowned in the initial chaos or been taken by the predators, the struggle was far from over. Exhaustion set in quickly as the men tried to keep themselves afloat in the relentless sea. Among them was William Thompson, a young private from the 91st Regiment who had been hurled into the waves as the ship was torn asunder. The moment he hit the water, Thompson gasped, his body stiffening in shock that this was really happening to him. A year ago he had been enjoying draughts in his local pub with his mates, hitting on the serving wenches, and now he was fighting for his life. He reached out blindly, his fingers scraping against a wooden barrel floating nearby. His arms were already trembling with fatigue as he clung to it, watching the black waves undulate beneath him. All around him he could hear the howls and sobs of other men, crying out for help, others calling for their mothers back home among the green hills of England, or praying that somehow they would survive. His mouth tasted of salt and fear. The night stretched on endlessly. Thompson's muscles ached, and his hands were raw from gripping the barrel for a time out of mind. His submerged legs cramped, and he found keeping his head above the waves harder and harder. The sea would roll in a heavy swell every few minutes, nearly pulling him under. At one point, a splash beside him made him whip his head around. It was Private Samuel Ford, his comrade, also struggling to stay afloat, his face ghostly pale in the moonlight. Will, I can't hold on," Ford gasped, his voice weak. He had managed to grab onto a piece of wreckage, but his strength was fading fast. Keep holding," Thompson urged, though his own voice was ragged in exhaustion. His arms were shaking violently, but he could not let go. Not now, not when dawn was so close, hoping somehow that would improve their situation. But dawn seemed an eternity away. More hours passed in agony as Thompson and the others clung to life in the black water. His thoughts were a blur, wavering between hope and despair. He could hear Ford's breathing grow shallower and shallower beside him until finally, with a soft splash, his chum's head fell forward. Thompson just stared dully at his friend's corpse until he was suddenly jolted as if by lightning as a fin appeared, and his mate's body was dragged beneath the waves. Thompson swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the seawater surrounding him. He felt a sudden sharp graze against his leg and thrashed wildly, terror gripping him as he realized another shark had arrived. He kicked as hard as he could, pulling his legs closer to the barrel, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard the stories. The killers were always there, waiting. He glanced around wildly, just barely able to discern the outline of fins slicing through the surface nearby. His prayers were now centered on the sharks, hopefully going for the easy prey of the motionless bodies. Time continued to crawl by, the moon giving way to the faint glow of dawn. Each minute was a battle to stay afloat, and every splash carried with it the fear of unseen predators lurking just beneath the surface. Thompson's legs trembled, both from the cold and the sheer exhaustion of treading water for what felt like an eternity. Just as Thompson thought he could hold on no longer, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The dim light was enough to push back the oppressive darkness, but it also revealed the grim reality around him. Bodies floated everywhere, some still alive and clinging to wreckage, others lifeless. The cries of men had grown faint, replaced by the soft lap of the waves against the debris. And then, through bleary eyes, Thompson saw it, a ship. He would soon learn that the schooner was named the Lioness, heading toward them. For a moment, Thompson could hardly believe what he was seeing. After hours of terror and despair, rescue was finally at hand. Having chanced upon the ghastly scene, the crew of the Lioness began pulling the living from the water, their bodies battered and broken but alive. Thompson was one of the last to be lifted aboard, barely conscious from his ordeal. As the sailors wrapped him in a blanket, he could hear the sound of the sea still roaring in his ears. Even though he was safe, only 193 of the original 630-plus people aboard the Birkenhead survived that night. Shivering and exhausted, Thompson lay on the Lioness's deck, thinking of the men who had not made it like his mate Ford and the soldiers who had held firm information. So many had been claimed by the sea. Survival, however, came with a heavy burden. The memories of that night, from the sharks to the cries of fellow castaways as they disappeared beneath the waves, would haunt them right up until their final days. But those who lived to tell the tale of one of the most extraordinary acts of collective courage in maritime history could also walk with pride upon their shoulders. Cornet Bond would later reflect on the disaster, saying, "We stood together knowing that death was upon us, but not one man wavered. We watched the women and children go, and then we waited for the sea to take us." Yes, the Birkenhead was lost, but its legacy endures as a symbol of valor and sacrifice. The soldiers who stood fast that night, ensuring the safety of women and children, exemplified courage and discipline in the face of certain death. Their bravery gave rise to the Birkenhead Drill, the principle of prioritizing womenfolk and children during maritime evacuations. Though the waters claimed their lives, their selfless actions remain a legend. And so another sorrowful tale of the sea comes to a close, leaving so many more souls united under a single mournful epitaph forevermore. The sea is my grave. My grave is the sea. Thank you for watching. We would love to hear your comments on the outstanding bravery displayed on the Birkenhead. And if you would enjoy more dramatized retellings, please be sure to rate, share and subscribe so that we may bring you more harrowing tales of the sea.